Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're headed to Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains about 3 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg ended in a long retreat for General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Here, on July 23rd, 1863, the 3rd Georgia Infantry hunkered down behind a broken rail fence overgrown by a tangle of grapevines and briars. Their number included the officer pictured here, 33-year-old Second Lieutenant and Adjutant John Lewis Ells of Company G. The Georgians and the rest of their brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Ambrose Wright, watched as a large column of Federals advanced on their position along the heights of the Blue Ridge. A message was promptly fired off to high command, quote, Wright's brigade of 600 muskets occupying Manassas Gap, protecting the flank of Hill's corps, have no cavalry or artillery, enemy in immediate front numbering from 10 to 20,000. Hasten to our support, end quote. The Federals launched a furious attack before Confederate reinforcements arrived. The regimental historian of the Georgians recalled, quote, soon their solid mass of columns appeared over the mountaintop, and they came pouring down upon us. When they arrived within 300 yards, our Enfield rifles commenced fire upon them, and as they steadily advanced, our boys kept up a continuous fire, which often broke their ranks and turned them back in confusion. But the fresh columns supporting their advance came on until, outflanked and borne down by the weight of numbers, our regiment was ordered to fall back to the supporting line behind us. The Yankees did not pursue, being checked by our artillery, which had, by this time, gotten into position. We had done heavy execution in the enemy's ranks, killing and wounding more than the total number of our regiment engaged, end quote. Though the Georgia boys did in fact inflict heavy casualties, the Union forces gave as good as they got, putting 75 Georgians on that casualty list, including Ells, who fell after a bullet tore into his right hip. The identity of the Union soldier who shot Ells is unknown. Whoever he was, he could not have known that Ells had a deep connection to the North and had spent a significant part of his life living among the Yankees. Back in the 1840s, when Georgia-born Ells was a teenager, he and his family moved from their home in Bibb County, Georgia, to Troy, New York. Though the reason they relocated to the Empire State is not known, it may be because they had family there. In Troy, Ells met Margaret Rickards, and they married in 1849 when Ells was about 20 years old. Their first child, a son, was born the following year, and a daughter soon followed. In the mid to late 1850s, the young family relocated back to the South, this time to Savannah, Georgia. Then, shortly before the war began, the Ells family moved to nearby Augusta, Georgia, where he replaced his retiring brother as an editor of the Daily Constitutionalist and Republic newspaper. In February 1860, while working as an editor, he also served as secretary for a meeting of secessionists that proclaimed in a single voice that, quote, their oaths of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States in no wise bound them to an abolitionist administration. Ells, the former New York State resident, was all for getting out of the Union, and the sooner the better. Georgia seceded from the Union a year later. After the outbreak of hostilities, Ells enlisted as a first sergeant in the city's Confederate Light Guards, which became Company G of the 3rd Infantry. The regiment was sent to Virginia. Several companies, including Ells, were ordered to the North Carolina coast in a failed attempt to repel enemy invaders. They returned to Virginia in the spring of 1862, leaving behind Union General Ambrose Burnside and his successful contingent of troops. The 3rd went on to participate in most of the Army of Northern Virginia's major actions over the next year. It fought furiously in the Bloody Lane at the Battle of Sharpsburg in September of 1862. During that battle, Ells suffered a minor wound, the nature of which was not reported, and he was promoted to 2nd lieutenant just a week later. At Chancellorsville in May 1863, the 3rd attacked a heavily fortified Union position. According to the regimental historian, the men, quote, climbed into the trenches among the Federals who, at the double quick, ran to the rear, end quote. The Georgians suffered 139 killed and wounded in that fight. The Georgians suffered again at Gettysburg soon after Chancellorsville. On the 2nd day of the battle, the 3rd and 2 other regiments in Wright's brigade charged the Union front on the Emmitsburg Turnpike near the Cadore farmstead, capturing several pieces of artillery and forcing the Federals back to a secondary line of defense along Cemetery Ridge. A second attack drove the Union troops from the heights, but it was not supported, and the brigade was forced back with severe loss. The Georgians lost 196 of 441 men and offers engaged 45% of its fighting force. The next day, July 3rd, the remnants of the regiment and the rest of Wright's brigade covered the retreat of Major General George Pickett's division after its infamous charge. Ells survived the intense fighting at Gettysburg without injury, only to be shot down 2 weeks later during the Confederate withdrawal at Manassas Gap, which is also known as Wapping Heights. The musket ball that struck his right leg lacerated muscles and lodged near his hip joint. He was sent to a hospital in Richmond for treatment. Surgeons were unable to extract the bullet. He was furloughed to his home in Augusta to recuperate. 4 months later, the wound was still unhealed, the bullet unremoved, leaving him in great pain and unable to walk without the aid of a cane or a crutch. He bounced in and out of the hospital over the next year and a half and eventually left the Army in December of 1864, never to return to command. Meanwhile, his 3rd Georgia fought on in Virginia. 4 months later, the remaining veterans of the 3rd, 12 officers and 236 men, were surrendered by General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Ells eventually recovered from his wound. His family grew to include a 3rd child after the birth of a daughter they named Jefferson Davis Ells. Her nickname was Jeffy. They later moved to Maryland and settled in Baltimore, where Ells worked as a newspaper reporter. He also became an officer in the Maryland National Guard, pledging his support of the state and the Union he once fought against. Ells lived until age 89, dying at age 59. So thanks for listening to the story of John Lewis Ells of the 3rd Georgia Infantry, his long service in the Army of Northern Virginia with the 3rd Georgia Infantry, and his woundings at Antietam and at Manassas Gap after the Battle of Gettysburg. We'll see you on the next episode of A Life on the Civil War Research Trail.